Today, I will not talk about what the poster said, obviously. That's beginner's mistake to follow the original program. I will try to attempt to continue a conversation we've been having for a few months now, at least in the Academics for Palestine groups and events and the teachings that we've been having, Peter and I, my colleague who's sitting next to me here. My name is Viktor. I'm a PhD student, teacher, researcher at the Department of Social Anthropology here at Stockholm University. I have been doing research on Palestine now for 6-7 years, writing a PhD thesis on politics of fun in Palestine. Not so much writing, but thinking. Anyway, we've been discussing since October the constant demand for the condemnation of the attack on the 7th of October. We've been talking about many different things here. We've been talking about the role of the category of the terrorists. We've been discussing the historical background of the events that happened on the 7th of October. We're all by now very familiar with the deep history that violence has in other sorts of colonial violence in Palestine. But I want to return to this idea of condemnation, and I want to return to violence more specifically, because we haven't really discussed violence that much. Its nature, why it looks in certain ways, in certain contexts, let's say. So I will try to talk about violence today and why the violence of October 7 didn't shock many of us, although it did shock us, obviously, that day. And I will do so by using an article that I found most useful when trying to grapple with this myself. The article was written during the Second Intifada by a fellow anthropologist called Ghassan Haj, recently fired from his position at Max Planck Institute in Germany. And his article is about the act of suicide bombing. And he's trying to explain, trying to come to terms with how suicide bombing can appear as a military tactics during the Second Intifada, and why when he tries to explain why this happens, becomes the target of this sort of demand of condemnation. You have to condemn it first before you explain, if you even explain at all. These are inexplicable acts. You shouldn't talk about them. So why is it that the 7th of October, just like the suicide bombings in the Second Intifada, cannot be talked about without being condemned first? And how can we, in a very formal, very quiet manner, talk about certain kinds of violence, in this case, right, colonial settler violence, not having to condemn it first, right? Why do some forms of violence demand some things and other forms of violence other things? Condemnation somehow relates to morality and the categorization of violence in different ways. What we see then is that only the Palestinian resistance operation on October 7th, like the suicide bombings during the Second Intifada, is necessarily a moral issue, right? It demands condemnation. It is in and of itself a moral issue immediately, while the colonial violence is not necessarily that same moral issue. The categorization of violence is interesting to a social scientist, I would say, in at least two ways. One, it raises sort of the constructivist question: who gets to decide, who gets to define what violence is, what categorizations of violence there is? Who benefits from these categories? It's clear to us that the use of classifying something as terrorism, as we've discussed before, is to sort of try to separate between normal people and non-normal people, but also normalized forms of violence and pathologized forms of violence. So two different types of violence become visible when we use the label terrorism or terrorist. And it is sort of as we've also discussed, a form of struggle on what violence should be allowed and not. That is also a struggle between states and opposing groups, where there is an uneven distribution of the means of violence. I'll return to this later. As well as an uneven distribution of the ability to classify one's own use of violence, right? What is legitimate violence and what is not? Secondly, it raises the sort of broader questions about academia, as condemnation works as a form of censorship to try to remove any attempts at understanding or explaining a social phenomenon, right? If explaining the social conditions of a social action instead of condemning the action off the bat becomes a political risk, something risky for us to do, how does it affect this sort of academic life, the job of the social scientist, which is to explain, right? If we are forced to condemn, we cannot explain, but our job is to explain. So what position do we take as academics? I agree here, I think, with Ghassan, as he writes in his article. Again, it's from the Second Intifada, but I believe it's really only become more significant over time. And I agree with him in that article, where he basically says that, yes, condemnation is absolutely in its place, in that I do condemn the conditions that creates this kind of violence, right? This is the condemnation that we make. We do not condemn the violence in and of itself. We do not condemn the perpetrators of violence. We condemn the social conditions that create the necessity for this kind of violence to happen. All right. So Palestinian acts of militant resistance are acts of violence directed against the Jewish colonizers of Palestine and their descendants in Israel and the occupied territories, that is to say in Palestine, who are seen as continuing the colonial enterprise. Looking back at history, of course, almost all anti-colonial struggles have used violence in different forms. This is nothing new. But what is made out to be different in the Palestinian case is the targeting of civilians. We know, of course, that this is not something exceptional, but it is made out to be exceptional. Palestinian militant resistance makes it difficult for the colonizer to live a so-called normal, peaceful life in the colonial settler state. And the Palestinian resistance does not respect the colonizer's division of labor, where the colonizer's military forces enforce colonization on the colonized while protecting colonizers. And on the other hand, you have sort of a civilian population enjoying the benefits of the military, right? The military occupation of land, the military colonization of Palestine. The resistance does not accept that strict division of labor as the colonizer wants it. This upsets the colonial logic and often changes the categorization of violence into one of terror, right? If you do not accept this division of labor, you are doing terrorist acts. Thus, a kind of violence that demands condemnation rather than explanation. But the violence on October 7, as well as the suicide bombings that Ghassan discusses in his article, demands condemnation from the general public because it also involves self-sacrifice. Let's be honest, none of the soldiers that were engaged in the operation on October 7 expected to ever return home. They expected death. This is what they faced. And the fact that the violence involves this kind of self-sacrifice makes us understand it as pathological, part of some kind of death drive, part of wanting to annihilate the self, part of some kind of self-destructive internal process, right? It becomes this psychological thing that cannot be cured, right? It's a pathology in the person doing the act. This kind of reasoning brings us into the position of the other being unexplainable, right? Being sick, being twisted, less human or not human like us, right? It separates us from the perpetrator of the violence. As a social scientist, this reasoning is of course never enough. The question we must ask then is, how do we understand self-sacrifice and militant resistance as a social practice? Something that people are doing in a social context, right? It doesn't come from nowhere. We cannot only condemn it, we have to explain it to understand it. From what social conditions does a social disposition, tendency towards this kind of violence and towards sacrificing the self emanates come from? I will return to this point in a bit. Back to the point on terror slightly, that in this sort of context has the function of, like I said, separating normalized kinds of violence from pathological kinds of violence. First, we need to remember that although the focus following the October 7 operation was only the violence of the resistance fighters coming out of Gaza, that violence is a minimal form of violence, right? We all know this. Although it's in the focus, it is a minimal sort of violence. Compared to the enormous ramifications of the settler colonial states and continuing Nakba, it's minuscule. So let us think about terror not as pathological violence then, but as a violence specific to a mode of distribution of the means of violence. The mode of distribution of the means of violence. No one wanted to die in the operation on October 7. Nobody wants to blow themselves up in a suicide attack. If Palestinians had access to tanks, warrior airplanes, nuclear missiles, and precision drone strikes, they would use them, right? If they had the access to that kind of military technology, it would be used in this battle. But they do not. There's an unequal distribution of the means of violence, where some are accessible for the occupier, the colonizer, while others are accessible for the colonized. And this kind of unequal distribution, you've all seen it from pictures of the checkpoints, pictures of the wall, pictures of the constant Israeli bombardment of Gaza for the past few months. Palestinian militant resistance like that on October 7 becomes more of a sign of life. The capacity to hurt the other, while knowing that the other has a much greater capacity to hurt you, symbolizes the survival of resistance itself, right? The violence of October 7 is not the colonizers' violence. They knew that they could never take over anything. It was a suicide mission. But it signified the survival of resistance. That is the function of that violence, as well as the suicide bombings during the Second Intifada. In combination with this unequal distribution of the means of violence, we have a very, very widespread social unavailability of any opportunity to make something of one's life in Palestine. Palestine overall, but especially in the refugee camps, especially in the refugee camps of Gaza. Social life, as we know it, as we want to understand it, it's something that offers us meaning. It offers us different paths to walk on towards a meaningful future. But there's a deep inequality in many societies in the distribution of meaningfulness. Meaningfulness, in other words, social importance, reasons for living, are unequally distributed in our societies, including in the Palestinian colonial context. An unequal distribution where some are valued as social beings, dignified with existence, while others are denied existence, right? Rejected their humanity. This is what we sometimes call social death, the absence of possibilities of a worthy life, or the absence of even being able to dream of a worthy life at some point in the future. I think Ghazan Haj also mentions this, but I remember this study done at Birzeit University during the Second Intifada, where they asked the students about their visions of the future. And the basic result of the report was, there's no vision of the future. Future does not exist. Our past exists, our present exists, but the future does not exist. Our social world is not showing us paths towards a meaningful future. And so, if life is meaningless, what is there to offer meaning to us? This could be many things, of course. I'm perhaps exaggerating this picture I'm painting a little bit. But nonetheless, we can see that in the Palestinian case, there has been fertile ground for what Ghazan Haj calls martyr culture. That is the social making of meaningful death. Life loses meaning, death seems to have gained meaning in this context. Death as meaningful for the individual herself, but also for the individual to be recognized as valuable by others, right? Socially recognized as a being, someone worthy of something. Ultimately, the becoming of a social being, someone recognized as someone, finally in the moment of death, in martyrdom. Death offers meaning and symbolic capital not offered elsewhere in Palestinian society. I'm exaggerating, but this is the context of death. This does not mean that every Palestinian wants to die, but it is part of a game of death that is present in Palestine constantly. One that starts with approaching soldiers, tear gas, and rubber bullets at an early age, constantly toying with the border to death, to the colonizers' violence. And it is formed against the backdrop of the social unavailability of opportunities to lead a dignified life. It is connected to the distribution of meaningfulness in society, in this case, in settler colonial society. Martyr culture, Ghazan Haj points out, is the swapping of a physical existence to finally have a symbolic existence, to be recognized as something valuable. This, in turn, is tied to the enormous violence of the occupying and colonizing apparatus and the chronic violations of Palestine, Palestinians, and Palestinianness. It's tied to it through the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes, from the gunshot wounds, and the thousands of dead. But it is also tied to it through affect, the way we feel and experience things, through the way that the colonization of Palestine is felt and experienced. And Ghazan Haj urges us to look at what he calls colonial humiliation. Humiliation is the experience of being psychologically demeaned, treated like less than a human being by someone more powerful than you, without you having a capacity to redress or change or challenge the other in that situation. On the other side of this colonial humiliation that we know in sort of an everyday routine way, at every checkpoint, at every part of the wall, at every roadblock, during every incursion of a Palestinian home or town, is colonial supremacy, right? A position, an experience of unquestioned authority and dominance, supremacy and humiliation. Again, we're seeing an inequality in the distribution of something, this time in the distribution of affects, the way we feel and experience our social world. The way we are allowed to experience and feel at our social worlds. And it is through militant resistance, or at least through some of its forms and organizations, that this colonial affect gets channeled, transforming the violated colonial humiliation into something else. It turns violence like that on October 7, turns colonial impotence and humiliation into anti-colonial potency. So this has mainly been a very basic overview of what Ghazan argued for suicide bombers during the Second Intifada. And I would say it's relevant for us today as well. He has used these three sort of modes of distribution as starting points when trying to grapple with what an anthropology of suicide bombers would look like. And I would argue that we could look at the same three processes of distribution, modes of distribution, to discuss the violence on October 7 as well. You might not agree with any of this. I might not even agree with all of this. But still, it is an attempt at explanation, at thinking about the violence that we've been told not to think about. Finally, I will not talk much longer. I want to try to tie this to some other issues that we're facing that are, in a sense, closer to us than October 7. It is not only suicide bombings and Tufan al-Aqsa, the operation on October 7, that we're not allowed to explain. There are more and more things in society around us that we are not allowed to think about. One of the most common issues, I think you've all seen this in the newspapers, is crime. Right? 10, 15 years ago, whenever you discussed crime, there was always a slightly left-inclined article published saying something like, oh, well, you know, there are certain social conditions in parts of our country that condition people to do certain things. If we change those social conditions, maybe those things won't happen. Right? That was a common sort of way of approaching the critique of not crime, right, but criminals as pathological. This critique has faded away during the past 10 years. Now, if you read an article about crime, there will be some tired comment in the beginning of the article saying something like, oh, well, and all of you guys trying to tell me that these criminals are somehow, just suffering from a bad childhood, please fuck off, They are pathological. We know that they are. They don't deserve explanation. We don't care if their mothers were bad to them, They are criminals. We need to lock them away. Justice equals order. Order in society, not explanation. Included in this during the past few years, maybe less so in Sweden than in other contexts, but still, the people who do try to stick to analysis or explanation are often told that they're out of touch, right? Not least academics. I mean, my God, so we sit in our ivory towers and we look down at the world and explain it. How? Why? Are you even part of the world? There's some kind of super privileged thing just floating on top, right? So the position from which to explain is also attacked. In this case, it's about academics, but you see the same process with journalism and other sort of previous positions of authority when it comes to explaining social processes. What social science basically tries to do when explaining social behavior is to create the possibility of putting the self in the place of the other, right? By explaining social action through its structures, through the way that the world is set in that specific place and time, we are saying that if we were in the same place and time, we could do the same thing, right? By pointing to this, rather than you as a pathological human being, we're saying that it's also possible for me to do these things. This is, of course, unacceptable when we're trying to create a colonial divide between correct forms of violence, incorrect forms of violence, West and West, state and terrorism, and so on. And with that, I want to come to the last point, which is when we talk about this demand for our condemnation, we should perhaps name it, right? What is it that we're facing? We're facing what is called exigophobia. Exigophobia, from Greek exigo, to explain, the fear of explanation. A growing fear that if we continue to explain things, we might have to actually look at the conditions that create certain social actions that we want to see as pathological. We don't want to change those conditions, which means we don't want to see them, because then we might have to change them. It's easier to just imprison people, shoot people, or perhaps just rip people's passports from them, right? And expel them. It's easier than looking at the social conditions that create social action. The other thing that we should, I think about and talk about in our time is homophobia. Homo meaning the same. In a time where we see fascism on the rise, we often say that it is due to xenophobia, the fear of the other. I would agree with Ghazan Haj, it's not. It's the fear of being seen as the same as the other. It's the fear of being told that if you were in those conditions, you would do the same thing. This to us is unacceptable. You cannot be me. I cannot be you. You are a terrorist. Your violence is not legitimate. Your existence is not legitimate. You do not have the right to exist as a human like me. Therefore, the fear of being seen as the same as the other is central. The fear of the other is fine. If the other is over there, that's great. We can continue our political project. But if the other is not allowed to be the other, but the same as us, we fail. Right? The fascist project falls. All right. I'll end it there, I think. Thank you for listening.
Let's just keep going. We'll open up for discussion. Yeah. Robert?
I'm also very happy to not take questions.
Right, any questions?
I can take this question. Thanks a lot, Richard.
That was really great, and I have a million things that I'm thinking of in response to what you said. One of the things I wanted to flag also for those of the audience and those who are following us on Zoom is a little bit about the context of the suicide bombings that we're talking about here, that Hassan talked about. Of course, those were the Hamas as an organization in its early inception as an organization understood itself to be partaking in armed or armed resistance. But among its principal targets in its early years, we understand it to have come into existence during the First Intifada in 1987, were Israeli soldiers who were kidnapped and killed, and also armed Israeli civilians. Hamas began its own campaign of suicide bombing in a very direct response to a very particular event. And that event was the massacre by American-born Israeli settler, Baruch Goldstein, of 29 Palestinian worshippers in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, the wounding of more than 100 more. 40 days, or 41 days specifically, so one day after the end of the mourning period after this massacre, Hamas conducted its first suicide bomb. And that is a notable event to mark because the present Israeli Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is an avowed, famous admirer of Baruch Goldstein. Baruch Goldstein became, of course, a patron saint of the Israeli right-wing settler movement. And Itamar Ben-Gvir famously has a picture of Baruch still in his house as a model for what he understands to be the settler colonial project in Palestine. Of course, and Ben-Gvir was a member of the same organization that Baruch Goldstein was a member of, the Kappa movement. So in that sense, the suicide bombing we're talking about is a very direct and symmetrical response to colonial terror that makes the mistake, we might say, of actually unmasking itself as terror, forcing even the Israeli state to call it, oh, this is terrorism, right? As opposed to, why can't you just keep shooting, soldiers killing people and terrorizing is also terrible. I was also struck the other day, we had an evening at Cafe 44 in Stockholm, with students, Stockholm academics from Palestine and other people, and we had a conversation surrounding a film, Joining a Freedom Fighter, in which one of our people participating there, who's not here with us today, but he pointed out to us that the original translation in the French, the translation of Fanon's, what is in English called The Wretched of the Earth, is Les Damnés de la Terre. A better translation would be something like The Damned of the Earth, or we might even say The Condemned of the Earth in that sense, from Latin for that word. And so when we're talking about that particular position, we are literally talking about a position being structurally condemned. I think that's important thing to explore. Other questions?
Comments or thoughts?
Thank you. I have a cold, so I'm not sure if my voice can be heard. My name is Annika Rob. I'm usually the oldest participant in these things. Anyway, to tie in with what Sharon was saying, is it a week ago that Sharon had his lecture about how can we teach, how can we do, and you were also talking about this as intellectuals and being condemned. So what sort of resistance should we do academically, both as students and as sort of, is there a way? Because it seems to me that very particular voices are given again credibility when they talk about terrorism or when they talk about what's going on, whereas others are not heard so much. So I would like to hear a view on this.
I mean, the simple answer is keep explaining, right? That's what we're here to do, and that's what we're here to teach, right? What Sharam talked about last time as well, sort of the inclination to think, to be allowed to, and to be encouraged to and given ways to think about things, not necessarily know things, but learn ways of thinking about things, help us forward, individually and collectively, right? Whether I'm the best to teach those or not, I don't know, but I sure aim to teach ways of thinking rather than cramming books down the throat of our students, I suppose. Some people get the spotlight, others don't. I guess we academics are partly at fault here, right? I mean, we do criticize each other and look at each other's texts and ideas, but we mainly do it in journals that only we read, right? Few academics criticize what Ranstorp says on SVT, so employee at Försvarshögskolan. His texts have been criticized in articles, partly in the popular press, but I think we must be much tougher on each other as academics as well. And sort of have the guts to tell each other that this is not a very productive way of thinking. I know you have a very long background within this field of study, but perhaps we should think other. Who's to do that and not in the academic climate that only privileges the publication of academic articles? I don't know. We have things to struggle with on our own as well, with our organizational structure and the funding of our departments and so on.
And yet, how much is this costing?
How much is this costing? This is for free.
Yeah.
As far as we know.
Thank you, Viktor. Yeah. Maybe I continue your about Annika's question.
Ah.
And I think, this is, as you say, the difference between knowing and thinking, yeah? Because, knowing is part of colonial demand of transparency. Demand of knowing everything. I want to know everything about you. And this is how maybe our discipline, anthropology, is also complicitly very. So there is a very fundamental problem with this knowledge production we're evolving, going back to enlightenment and the notion of human, in which we are not included. Yeah. Yesterday was a talk by a professor at Uppsala University talking about universal humanism. And then, when he was challenged, that, what is this humanism? It's not clear for him, he couldn't even understand the question. Because in that humanism, which European modernity, European enlightenment, all human rights, all international law, this is why they didn't work when it comes to Palestinians, yeah? When it comes to Afghans, because they are not included in that humanity. Yeah? So, and even Hannah Arendt, which I have learned so much, when she lived a long time in the United States, but she failed to understand the resistance by Black Americans. She couldn't understand, yeah. She reduced it into gang violence, yeah. So even a thinker like Hannah Arendt, who is a fabulous philosopher, violence, revolutions, resistance, power, when it comes to Black people, it fails. I don't have answer for that why, but there is a failure, and it has to do with this European project of modernity, which is phased when it comes to Black people, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to. Yeah, so that was more or less, yeah, some. My comments. Thinking with you.
Yeah. Thank you. Of course, as the commie I am, I have to add, to the colonial enterprise, of course, the capitalist enterprise of making things known, countable, sort of, the financialization relationships as well. And
Thanks, Victor, for the good talk. I appreciated it and enjoyed it very much. You told me a new word, exegophobia. Can you just explain that a little bit further? Is it? Because to my mind, there are explanations being given, just maybe not explanations that you and I agree with. But that aside, what explains the fear in academia in particular? What are people so afraid of? Why not explain things in a traditional way, like you said, a couple of decades or a decade ago? What is stopping people from identifying actual problems, actual causes of these things?
in academia specifically?
I mean, yeah, but you can talk about it more generally if you like. It's up to you, answer it how you wish, but. Well, maybe if you can start with the immediate environment that we're in, which is academia. What are people so afraid of?
I have only vague hunches to answer this, right? But aren't we also living in times where being seen as political is always something bad? Has this weird, clingy sort of thing to it. He's political, he's doing things that might actually change things, or he's talking about these conditions that we all know are there, but very hard to change. My God, it's so political. And then it's just a fear of the political as such, of having to actually, I mean, in academia specifically, right? I mean, anthropologists are very much part of this constant issue, right? You point out problems, where are your solutions, right? At the same time, if you offer a solution, you're political. If you offer the wrong explanation, pointing out the wrong factors, you're also political. I think there's a fear, and there is a rising interest in pointing out who is political and not, and political in this sense that sticks to you in a way. It means that anything you say is somehow complicit in some bigger conspiracy that you're not really revealing. So I think we're there. I can't really explain why and how we got there, but I think that's a fear among our colleagues, to be honest. Did you agree? Do you have any?
I agree. It's definitely difficult to be political, and especially to dissent, to disagree with the dominant narrative and the dominant ways of thinking. There are primarily for me, I think, one major view is the decline of the unipolar world. I think people are afraid of that. I think they see war in East Europe, they see in Gaza, in Palestine, they see impending war in East Asia. People are, even established scholars and academics are really concerned, don't know what about how to deal with it. Because they see these signs as the decline of the unipolar world. That's one explanation that I can think of.
Yeah.
But you cannot solve anything by being afraid of explaining it. Instead, we need to face it and explain things properly, to address them properly.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you're just gonna run, chances are you're gonna run off a cliff.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with you and go maybe even further. That's so the unipolar world is somehow fading, or we're experiencing that it's fading. Which also brings us to this kind of to a kind of war or siege mentality, or war or siege culture, right? Where again, you have to condemn it becomes more important because it forces you to a side. It forces you away from explanation. It forces you away from saying, well, you know, they're like us, just with different conditions. It forces you to say, no, they are other. An attempt to explain them would be treason in the war or siege mentality, in the war or siege culture. It is dangerous, not just for you, but for us as a collective. We are threatened. I mean, this is also part of a border mentality. Right? We have to protect what's inside. We have to force away what's sort of threatening us constantly. So I guess, yeah, the fall of the unipolar world, putting us in this kind of mode, definitely drives a change towards this fear of explaining the other, because explaining the other means that we're the same, which is we cannot be in a situation where we are going to war.
To add on to that, I'm just wondering. I find it interesting what you're saying that people are afraid of being political, but I also have this sense, I don't know if it's true, but that some politics are okay to discuss and others are not. Like, we can talk about women's rights without that being like Viktor, the dude talking about women's rights. But talking about Palestine, that's a hot topic, that's a difficult topic, but so it's also like part of the narrative in of itself, I think. On what gets to be political and what is just being research or explaining history or because we can explain, or at least like what I felt through my studies, we can talk about gender and women's history and their place in history. Without that being seen as political, more as maybe a modern way of educating. But if we were to voice the colonial outside the perspective of the past, then all of a sudden it's very political.
Yeah, what is allowed to be politics? I mean, that's always the first question you need to ask, right? When looking into politics, what is political and not. I think maybe yeah, I'll continue where you stopped, right? Where, okay, some things are allowed to be politics, some things are not even seen as politics, although they have perhaps been politics at some point. Now they're incorporated into some kind of being modern or being developed or being whatever. And if you try to change that, right, and make it the politics again, something happens, there's resistance. I think that ties on to maybe what Peter was talking about in a previous teaching, where sort of connection between affect and effects, which is you're allowed to feel certain things from a political position, right? You are positioned as a woman, as a Palestinian in exile, and from that position, you're allowed to feel certain things, right? But you're not allowed to act on those things, because acting on those things would mean that we end up in a very much more dangerous political situation, where effects actually doing something and affect feed off each other. If movement starts, it's hard to stop, right? You push a car down the street, it'll keep rolling. It's no good. So you're allowed to feel in certain ways, but then acting on them is risky. Again, I also want to tie back to what Shalom said the other week, which is also the priority of order over justice, right? Which is sort of, yes, things are in a certain way in our society. We're all aware that some people are more marginalized than others. Some people have resources, others don't. It's a very complex, issue. The important thing is that we keep order, at least. Without order, we have nothing. My God, we dive into chaos. So order is prioritized. You're allowed to be in your position and be aware of that position and feel from that position, but to act out will be to take a stance for justice over order, which is not good in an era where we are approaching more and more fascistoid ways of thinking and acting.
I just want thinking with you, and I was surprised to hear professors, who have been in 50 years writing about cosmopolitan and all these beautiful things. When it came to Palestine, so they say no, this is a conflict going back to Ottoman Empire. So this has nothing to do with, today or us. And removing, raising all colonial history, and the role of Europe in the conflict. Yeah? So this is linked to a notion of unthinkable history. This anthropologist Michel Rolf-Troyon wrote about Haitian revolution. The title of the book is Unthinkable History. Is about how Haitian's revolution became invisibilized as a revolution. Haitian revolutionaries as subject king actors with bills, free bills, and it became something else. So this is exactly the same thing happening. Everything is reduced to Hamas, as Hamas is a crazy bunch of people, going around raping, killing, doing things. This is exactly, turning Palestinian resistance into unthinkable history. So, yeah.
Yeah, and of course here, coming back to the university, we as in the bigger university body, complicit in this, right? I'm sure you also read the program for the series of conversations to be held at Accelerator, right? So our little art installation center that was announced as how do we discuss the war against Hamas in Israel, as if that is what we need to discuss.
The first one, I wrote to them and said, true, we have to do that. Every time we see something about Israel and the war against Hamas, we have to write. I've written to my trade union.
We have a retired professor writing. We have a professor writing.
It's hopeless, but
No, the first talk is today, so
Yeah.
It's good to go there and
Yeah, please. Do you remember more exactly what it's about and who's going to be there?
No, I don't know
No, me either,
the people, but today is at 6:00, the first one. Yeah, and they say it's about the war. They put it, the first sentence is the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then Israel's war with Hamas.
Right.
And then when I send, as Annika, we received an answer which is not an answer. Yeah.
And as Annika just reminded me, the topic of the talk is how do we establish peace? Mutual peace. Huh? Order.
I remember seeing a placard at a demonstration, there's a picture of a demonstration, I think, Palestine demonstration in the US. And I don't remember the exact wording, but the effect of the placard was, peace is the white man's word, our word is justice. Right, that's in terms of what we want. And I think this, yeah, so it's in a talk that I also encourage everyone to go there, of course, and you know, perhaps make your feelings and thoughts known. It's Accelerator today, and it's I think it's framing themes, in fact, peace movement, to think about the possibility of peace in today's world. It's at 8 o'clock at Accelerator. It's part of a series, in fact. So 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock. It's part of a series talks that we have. I wanted just to say something also on kind of just something else that that your talk made me think about, Victor, because it's, of course, it's about the question of life and death, and I think one important difference in how to think question of life, which posit that as on the one hand a sort of kind of emblematically modern capitalistic way of thinking, feeling it and understanding it. And then there are other ways, and one of those ways is a kind of enduring Palestinian way of thinking about it. And I think it's also a way of thinking about it if you're in struggle in a certain sense, as being understanding yourself as not being merely a subject position, ontological stuff. That is, that life is always relation. That you are not something in and of yourself. You are relational, constitutively. Right? And if you are relational, then you simply cannot live. Then your life is always the worth of your life. What it is, its meaning is always expressed in terms of others. Right? And that allows you to make an act for others, right? To be an act for life as such, right? And that notion of life as being relational, I think, is something one can pose to the notion of life itself, which has in fact been quite become, you know, I think something, a term, a way of thinking about it that we often use in academia, following Michel Foucault, this notion of biopolitics, which is, there's a particular notion of modern governance, modern states become preoccupied with cultivating something called life itself, right? But of course, what is also happening there is that the very notion of life itself is being transformed, precisely transformed into life as some sort of biological. It's supposed to be a social. And I also wanted to tie that to how this series of teachings came about. Because it was, I remember, as far as I remember, it was there was a walkout, and I remember Stephanie was there, and Stephanie was driving so much of what we were doing here at university campus, and we were sort of standing around, and I was there, and Victor was there, and we started talking to each other because we just simply felt that we had to say something to each other. And it was about responding to each other. It was about relating to each other. It was not about, you know, it was simply, you know, the feeling that we are here together and we have to acknowledge each other. And I think that's the foremost thing that, you know, the sort of violence, modernity, the violence of second colonialism that does, right? It's refusal to face the other, right? It's pretending that the other is not there, right? I have a friend of mine in Palestine who was arrested and tortured many times during the first Intifada. And one of the scenes he recounts, it's one of the most, I keep returning to it. He was dragged into, he was arrested, beaten up, as one always is, in the Jeep, and then taken to an interrogation center where it was winter, it was raining outside, and they stripped him naked and made him stand outside in the rain for hours. And then they dragged him, shivering, blue in his body, you know, sort of put in my chair in an office in front of an officer. And he recalls, I was sitting there shaking and you know, bruised, and he was talking to his wife about dinner, was saying, "I'm going to be home soon, honey. You know, what are you cooking?" Completely ignoring that he was there. And that to me was still this, what is this colonial violence? Right? It's completely pretending that the other doesn't exist.
Can I end on a positive note or a small positive
Are we
news?
ending? You want to end us?
My area, I mean, my area. Today, the Norwegian, or maybe yesterday, the Norwegian government announced that they're going to penalize Norwegian companies who have links to the colonial settlement from the West Bank. I think the Norwegians are very, I mean, things are going on there, so this is, we should, but I don't think we're going to make our government be able to do the same thing, but you know, small nurses anyway, so hooray Norwegians. Who have not cut off funding to UNRWA and who are very, very active on the refugee scene.
I think it's very interesting to see how countries that have their own oil acts. No, that was it.
I think also I want to say when what we want to see is a boycott in Israel as such. I mean, because this is still this notion that you're going to boycott settlements as if you can separate them economically from the rest of Israel is simply infeasible, right? And so yes, it's a step in the right direction, really.
Thank you for a good lecture and some good questions and saying about it. Kind of complex subjects. I just wonder the actual process of dehumanize people. The actual, if we, for example, take it in context of Swedish society, I think my own experience is that we tend to protectionize these kind of very tough questions, very tough. From the children, for example, I'm a little inspired by Freire's idea of this kind of taking distance from hard subjects in order to make the educational pedagogy just float in some sort of systematic idealism, for example. I'm not so sure about this, but could this have something to do with dehumanization, the kind of polarized world, maybe individualized idea that you could just feather your own nest, don't have to interact with this kind of tough questions, you don't have to make social relations. I'm just thinking about, for example, the alienation of the UN. I think in order and justice here, for example, reading Rawls and this kind of academic movement post World War II, very high engagement with this kind of tough subjects, and with the recent memory of human deprivation or repression and such. But if you take it in context for now, I'm not sure how present the UN are in these kind of subjects in the academia, for example. How we distance this, how we make like large distances in order for us to engage, or is that possible to change, for example?
I don't know. Of course, it's always possible to engage. I mean, it's always possible to change. That's the only thing we know is possible, right? Change. Things never stay the same. So things will change for sure. To what, we don't know. I think you're right. The taking the creation or the maintenance of distance is quite important. I think, I mean, this is just my own sort of weird, social media expertise as a person who doesn't use social media at all. Which is, I mean, don't we have many growing trends of this kind of self-isolation movements? Everything from 19-year-old men on TikTok talking about stoicism, right? Whatever happens out there, I will be strong. I will face things head on. I will protect my family. We have this kind of isolationism in our culture, no? The same thing with mindfulness, as we've been discussing in my class recently, right? You're stressed at work, it doesn't concern the structures of your workplace. It concerns your inner well-being. If you just meditate for 5 minutes every morning, the structure will just magically disappear and your work will be fine, right? Just look inside yourself, know your authentic self, find your inner peace and motivation, and all of these structures will just fade, right? So we have this kind of isolationism in our perhaps individualistic sense of ourselves. So, I mean, this might be a very localized phenomenon here or on yeah.
Just wanted to add another example. Like, the example of visualization is another one that comes up a lot on social media. It's like anything bad happening in your life is essentially made your responsibility by abstract some concept that if you just think about it hard enough, you'll get out of your situation or you'll have what you want one day. But yeah, excellent points, thank you.
I'm glad that you finally turned such an inspiration.
Yeah.
Mindfulness.
Yes, I have watched a lot of mental coaches YouTube.
Can I see what it was in? Fabian. So Fabian, I just like also the notion of childhood that you brought up, because I think in Sweden, I know few other societies in which one creates a separate world for children, the same that we do here. We can sort of, in all kinds of ways that also comes to be expressed in kind of a playfulness, I think, also, which is nice, sort of a celebration of that. But it's also struck me that what is happening is in fact a sort of a collective infantilization of us as people, as audiences, and that entails really populating our world with cartoon characters, right? The terrorist is a cartoon character. It's a one-dimensional, a creature. I remember reading quite recently now, I think a couple of months ago, an article in Dagens Arena, which is a magazine, which I would probably like to see itself as being on the Swedish progressive side of politics, leftist, and it was an editorial article in which the writer was saying that she just had to say something about Gaza, that it was too unbearable. In this sort of, wrestling with emotions and really not knowing what to do, but feeling the need to say that yes, of course, Hamas was such people that just wanted to have violence, they just wanted to have fiction. So here was a magazine on the left. This was at thought to the daily news coverage. And they were literally talking about the world, people, the characters, protagonists, as cartoon characters, They just want violence. Who wants just violence? No one wants just violence.
Could I just comment? I think I was in a meeting, attending a meeting with some people of the Haninge community, and they were struck by the very notion that these kind of young people attending to fritidsgården, I'm sure which were for the after school activities, main point, they were struck by the point that the kids were actually they wanted more education. Okay, so when they exit school, they actually want to learn something. Okay, and they didn't understand why. Okay, and I just gave them kind of idea that educational, these kind of educational structures they are attending every day could be maybe something alienating. Also, maybe they are too effectivized. For example, maybe they lack the very individual kind of reflection upon the world that they are studying in school. Okay, so what I told them was that, well, we could maybe have some students just paying some attention to their thoughts, and maybe they could just reflect upon with their own kind of voice instead of this structuralized school, which I am very much critical. But I'm just thinking about I'm lacking point here, but engaging with such of humanizing activities, for example, taking a stance for humanist ideas, the values of life, I think could have in this kind of individualized Western society be too elitist, maybe you you just make responsibility to the ones supposed to know these kind of questions. Maybe you don't have, maybe you're lacking the responsibility of self-reflection, and in order to make your own belief and in order to make your own stance in the questions. I just take, for example, the young criminals right now present, shooting each other and such. It's just the solution in the debate, I think, is towards the authorities. Okay, it's not up to the civilian society. It's not up. And then I met some mothers in Rinkeby, and they are out just walking, trying to engage with youth in order to make some change. And when I heard that, it was like some other planet, because it's no one in my neighborhood doing this kind of activities. And maybe we are too effectivized, maybe it's too elitist, I'm not sure, but just some thoughts on the topics.
You elite nonsense.
I just, yeah, I don't have an answer. Just reflected shortly on something you said, this, which is also the confusion of justice with punishment, right? Just these people doing these horrible things need to be punished. The confusion of justice and punishment. But
Yeah, adding on to that, I also think that for politicians, at least today, it's quote unquote sexier to impose punishments other than let's bring in more safe adults to guard an area, or let's invest in more after school activities, or, I mean, harder punishments, it sounds better. I think it's one of the reasons why we're ignoring what research are showing on how to work towards lessening criminal activity in society. But I also think like a main point that's been, like, at least a word I've been lacking, I've been missing in this teaching is class. I mean, like, and you can connect it to the Palestinians, so like the youth that are criminals today, they're just like that, you know, that's who they are. They want that Gucci hat, right? So they will do whatever, because it's cool and it's in their nature, it's in their DNA. And we've kind of, in today's debate, eradicated the word class. We're not talking anymore about the people who don't have money, have always, throughout history, done shady business forever, but now it's always multiculturalism, it's who they are, we imported this shit, and this is why we have more crime now, obviously, because it's who they are. Which makes me also think of the word order, if you connect it to good old Edward Said, it's also like being civilized, right? And the other is not. So forget justice, we're civilized, no matter the cost. And we just change it to word.
yeah, class has been sometimes talked about, I think, in the debate, but not in that term, right? The politicians prefer to talk about socioekonomiska bakgrunder, socioekonomiska faktorer. They're talking about class, but in a way that's not class.
Område.
Yeah, using geography or just using ethnicity as a way to talk about class. We're using statistics to minimize the importance of class, right? Instead of doing some of, I mean, what I at least attempted to do today, right? Which is, you know, resources are unequally distributed in our society. We need to see the consequences of that. They're both symbolical, economic. It's about violence, it's about many different things, right?
It's not sexy.
That's why we're academics.
I think it's a great,
It's muted. You took it.
I mean, I think that's a question we've been asking for a long time. Right, exactly what happened to class. One answer is this Wilbur's, I think, classic formulation by now, which is that race is the best primary modality in which class is expressed, for instance. So in Sweden.
So this isn't a question really, more a reflection or like the Middle Eastern caricature, especially the Middle Eastern man. I mean, that one's, the terrorist is very modern, the man as a terrorist, but there's always been this sort of caricature of the Middle Eastern man. So in the 18th century, it was very much the sexual deviant, the barbaric man who has a harem and 10,000 wives or whatever. And so it's just changed shape, which I find very interesting after the 19th century or 20th century. And I also, in connection with that, I've thought a lot about how sort of anti-Semitism has been put on that man, the Middle Eastern man, when the Holocaust was done by Europeans. However, we see the Middle Eastern people as anti-Semitic now. We've sort of put the European guilt of the Holocaust on them. And yeah, I just find that very interesting. I don't really know how it happened or why it happened, but it's happened. And I just think about it sometimes.
Yeah, we discussed this before, the absurdity, especially our neighboring country, Germany, right? Middle Eastern men are pointed to when it comes to sort of an issue of anti-Semitism in our country. It's an imported problem from the Arab world, anti-Semitism. In Northern Europe, it's a short attention span for history.
I always find it instructive to think of that in relationship to the notion of the tolerance that we have. We pay lip service to, and in different kinds of ways. And it's an interesting term, tolerance, because we celebrate it as we celebrate it as something that should be that is praiseworthy. But of course, when you say you tolerate something, you're always already inscribing it as something that is problematic. You don't tolerate a beautiful song. You enjoy it, you like it. You tolerate someone, they're always already a problem, right? But if you're in a tolerant society, how do you then rationalize your own increasingly rabid racism towards someone else? Well, you do it in the terms of tolerance. You say, I cannot tolerate them because they are intolerant. They cannot tolerate the other, right? And so that's the logic. And so one way to think this way in this anti-Semitism is operational is as a way to launder your own racism. To make it, I think that's how you understand it's the explosiveness of the sort of anti-Palestinian sentiment. It's something, the way in which the right parties are pouncing on this opportunity to really get at Muslims, the racial other in Sweden, nonsense. And to your point about the inversion of the image of the Arab, Joseph Massad, Syrian academic at Columbia University, has written about this for those who are interested. Desiring Arabs, I think is the title of the book. But controversial figure in the queer community. But one of the points he makes is not only is there an early modern European conception of the Arabs being having sort of being licentious and having harem, but also there's an understanding of the Arabs being queer in the sense of, oh, they sleep with boys, they do everything like that, right? And this is sort of a complete, just free for all, and then we arrive, about 100 years later, and then arrive at the completely opposite point where completely sexually deprived, cruel, whatever. But in fact, that's how we understand their violence. I mean, Thomas Friedman has written about this. Their sexual frustration leads them to violence and sort of thing. Right? What has changed? Well, what simply has changed is the European, their understanding what is the normative problem way to understand themselves now as we Yeah, what do you think? More questions? Say something. If not, to call it meeting?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and next week.
Next week, what do we have next week? We don't have anything else. What do we have after? Yeah, the 27th, March 27th, we have Stefan Helgesen, who is a professor of English, also the Dean of Humanities at Stockholm University. We're talking about it's kind of a lost moment, or a moment in a forgotten moment in which Swedish writers thought and wrote in the anti-colonialism. And that's 1 to 2 o'clock, March 27th. We bring up that so that If you are here and you're not a member of our Facebook group, which is Teachings for Palestine, please join that, and then we'll send out, you'll get the news of when we have our teachings. I encourage you also, if you're students, to join Stockholm Against Palestine, which is supporting this, organizing this. Thanks to Joachim, to Stephanie, Tesfaye, who's here, and helping us with this. And PhDs in Sweden for Palestine, also. And get involved in all the ways that you can. We have demonstrations on Saturdays in Stockholm, usually departing from Odenplan at 1 o'clock, with a gathering at 1 o'clock, meeting at 1:30 or so. And there are now very large demonstrations. I don't think we've had demonstrations like this in Stockholm for a long time, continuously. So something is happening. And in every way you can, if this is something that you're concerned about, don't let yourself be silenced, in moments in classrooms and elsewhere where people are telling you we can't talk about this, it's too political. Insist that you want to talk about genocide in the contemporary movement, to talk about racism, to talk about everything that's important. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you all again